for in-person audience and to our online audience for joining us today for this book roundtable. So I'll do the brief introductions. So we'll start with Dr. Andrew Needham, who is Associate Professor of History at NYU, where he teaches recent U.S. environmental and Indigenous history. He's the author of Power and Line, Phoenix and the Making of the Modern Southwest, which won awards from the Western History Association and the American Society for Environmental History. He has co-edited two recent volumes, Indian Cities, Histories of Indigenous Urbanization and New Energies, and New Energies, a history of energy transitions in Europe and North America. And he's currently working on a book about the intersection of oil and politics in the early 20th century, centered around the Teapot Dome scandal. With us too in our online audience is Dr. P. Jane Hafen, who's from Taos Pueblo. She's Professor Emerita of English at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. She's the editor of Help Indians Help Themselves, the later writings of Sitka Tha, and co-editor with Brendan Brensink of Essays on American Indian and Mormon History. Our final discussant is professor here at UT Austin. His name is CJ Alvarez. He's author of Borderland, Border Water, A History of Construction on the US-Mexico Divide, which won 2 book awards for its contribution to our understanding of the built environment of the border. He's currently writing a book about the environmental history of the Chihuahuan Desert, and he is an associate professor here at the Department of Mexican, American, and Latino Studies. And the author of the book in question is Dr. Disumek, who has been recently promoted to full professor. Congratulations. He's the author of the award-winning Indian Maid, Navajo Culture in the Marketplace, 1848 to 1940, and the co-editor of Nation States and the Global Environment, New Approaches to International Environmental History. Thank you all for being here with us.
Okay, well, I'm just going to say a few words about the book, but first I want to start with an acknowledgement that we are meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral home for what is now called North America. I want to acknowledge the Alabama Coushatta, Caddo, Carrizo Pumacudo, Cahuatecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur, Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or who have become part of these lands in Texas. And then I want to thank everyone for coming to my book talk today. And I really don't want to take up too much time going over all the different parts of the book, because I really hope one of the things that can happen at the roundtable will be a wide-ranging discussion about both the content of the book and the process of writing such a book. But to start today's presentation, I thought I would give people who are unfamiliar with where I'm talking about a little information. So let me just share my screen here and get this ready set up. So this is the dam, Glen Canyon Dam, that we are talking about. And this is where, now we need Zoom to cooperate. And this is where the dam is located on the Colorado River Plateau. The dam sits along the Utah-Arizona border, so you can see where Lake Powell is where the dam is. It was officially proposed in 1946 and it was completed in 1966, though plans for the dam, as I show, were rooted in much earlier eras. So why does the dam exist? That is one of the questions I sought to answer in the book. And in answering it, I hope to move a discussion about the dam beyond the environmental debates surrounding the dam that occurred in the mid-20th century. So when the dam was first proposed, it was part of a number of different dams that were proposed at the same time. It was wildly controversial. And lots has been written about those controversies, and I don't downplay them, but I did want to kind of move the direction of the focus of the book in a different direction. It is not an exaggeration to say that Lake Powell and Glen Canyon Dam are in the news almost every single day. People question what will happen when the reservoir levels drop. Currently, the reservoir's water level is at 3,521 feet. I checked yesterday. Minimum power pool is 3,490. So it's a hydroelectric dam. Drought, climate change, and water use habits are all things that are affecting the current crisis at Lake Powell. And all of these issues are issues that are related to the larger topic of my book. There are a lot of histories of the dam, given that it was so controversial. So one of the things I really was thinking about is if you're writing a history of the dam, when should the history of that dam begin? Should it start in 1922 when the Colorado River Compact, which was a problematic agreement that divided the water of the Colorado River between the upper and lower basin states? And you can see here on the screen the upper and lower basin states. Should it begin when that agreement was signed? Maybe I could start in 1946 when the legislation was proposed. I could have made any of those events key focal points of my book, and many people have actually started at those different moments. And just as a side note, and I see Andrew Curley is here, I need to promote that we have a panel on the 1922 water agreement, the Colorado River Compact, occurring here in April at the IHS. So I encourage everybody to come to that as well. But these moments are all critical moments in the history of the dam. But in trying to tell a new story of the dam, I picked a new kind of focal point or starting point. And in essence, what I attempted to do was center the discussion around the original inhabitants of the region and their history, and make their history part of the history of the dam. I'm not arguing that they built the dam, though there were many Navajo workers who helped construct the dam, and the book demonstrates that the Navajo Nation was instrumental in helping the Bureau of Reclamation site the dam. And these episodes are episodes that I cover in my book. But the book also represents my attempt to assert that we cannot tell the story of the region's water infrastructure or regional engineering without acknowledging the Indigenous people, the Navajo, the Ute, the Paiute, the Hopi, or Puebloan peoples, who developed deep troves of knowledge about the region's land and water and how to care for it and store it. Following that story forward then, we see that almost every group of newcomers, white settlers to the arid Colorado Plateau, first looked to Indigenous people and their knowledge of the land and the water before deciding where to settle and how to build. They mined that knowledge as a resource, and then they often worked to erase the fact that they had done that. And I chronicle these processes in the book. In the end, I argue that Glen Canyon Dam rests on the processes through which white settlers laid claim to the region, namely through settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is central to the book as a form of colonialism where colonizers take territory and resources from Indigenous people in order to foster their own permanent settler societies. Across the Colorado Plateau, white settlers work to establish their own religions and laws, their own science and their own engineering, and to build their own roads and dams and irrigation projects, and to embed their culture into the landscape as a way of replacing or attempting to replace, they were never wholly successful, Indigenous societies with their own culture, their own values, their own ideas about land use. And part of the problem with those philosophies has kind of gotten us where we are today, which is something I feel is worth at least having a little discussion about. In other words, the dam stands as a monument to these sorts of efforts of settler colonialism. On the Colorado Plateau, settler colonialism had an infrastructural component that combined both social and physical infrastructures. The combined force of those infrastructures became the expression of settler colonialism I call infrastructures of dispossession. And that is the core idea of the book, and one that I develop in different chapters throughout the course of the book. And I show in these episodes how these things, the combined force of these things, occur in relation to one another. And that's what I hope we can talk about. And I'm really looking forward to everyone's remarks and answering specific questions about the book.
So now he's
Andrew, maybe?
Andrew's turn.
Okay, I can start. Oh, good. There. That would now I can see everyone and not in like a tiny little box. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm on Lenape ancestral homelands and in the city that has the largest population of Indigenous people of any city in the United States. And I'd also like to kind of just say what a pleasure it is to be here today to discuss Erica's really wonderful and beautiful new book. When I opened it up and saw color images on the inside, I was both wowed and insanely jealous. But I'd also like to thank the Institute for Historical Studies for the invitation, to thank Courtney for the last minute technical wizardry that has me here, my fellow panelists, and of course Erica for writing this book. There's so much I'm looking forward to discussing with everyone here about the foundations of Glen Canyon Dam. But I want to start by providing some broad comments about the book's major accomplishments in Indigenous history in the field of settler colonial studies. I think like one of the major accomplishments, right, is just going to be taking the story of Glen Canyon Dam, which has largely been told as a story of kind of environmental political history, kind of located in the halls of Congress and pressure by the Sierra Club, and relocating the story of the foundations of this dam in the long process of dispossession and settler colonialism, in and on the Colorado Plateau. Perhaps the most important mantra of settler colonial studies, something that's been intoned numerous times, is Patrick Wolf's statement from his 2006 essay, Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native, that invasion is a structure, not an event. Like many influential theses that become over time mantras, a structure, not an event, has shifted from an explanatory mechanism of the particulars of dispossession to an almost reflexive rhetoric that is frequently used in an offhand manner. When the phrase comes up in an informal discussion, a structure, not an event, is frequently preceded with, of course. And interestingly, invasion is replaced by settler colonialism itself. Of course, settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. And when used in this fashion, that phrase, that mantra, kind of ceases to be a way of advancing inquiry and understanding, of showing how settler colonialism came to exist in particular places in time, how we can understand, how we can kind of investigate through synecdoche, how the part helps us understand the whole, and instead it becomes a, reflexive acknowledgement of shared principle, of shared belief that settler colonialism is an important framework. Perhaps, dare I say, a structure, not an event, has become an infrastructure of settler colonial studies. Acknowledging shared principles is all well and good, but it doesn't actually do that much to create new understandings of how settler colonialism functioned in place, space, and time. I think it actually kind of works against it, because it kind of forecloses further kind of discussion. And so I think one of the major accomplishments of Erica's book is to disrupt the mantraization of a structure, not an event. The way that she uses it as a spur for showing the kind of manifold and overlapping ways that settler colonialism took shape on the Colorado Plateau. This book is really a triumph of show, don't tell historical writing. And in each of these 5 really beautifully written chapters, she shows kind of how the infrastructures of dispossession came to function to kind of erase Indigenous both visibility and voiceability in the on the Colorado Plateau. Most substantially, Erica turns structure into infrastructure. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about, what infrastructure does that maybe structure doesn't. And I think it's a really important move that she's made. She takes a term, structure, that's been mainly thought of in pretty abstract ways. As Anthony Giddens put it, both the medium and the outcome of the practices which constitute social systems, like a very vague kind of thing that's very hard for me to wrap my head around. And she substitutes infrastructure, something that is far more, dare I say, concrete. That will be the last pun I make, I promise. So how is infrastructure different than structure? First of all, infrastructure is less a function of social process and more a manifestation of social power in Erica's book. As she writes, infrastructure is constituted as the key social systems that dominant society impresses upon the land and people. On the Colorado Plateau, infrastructure, in Erica's terms, refers less to the construction of physical objects, as to the creation of institutional authority necessary for such objects to be built on dispossessed land. The social infrastructure she investigates, religious expansion, scientific investigation and expedition, place naming, map making, legal formation, just to name 5 or 6 of them, function to dispossess Indigenous peoples of their lands and to erase Indigenous presence. And as Erica frequently shows, to just blatantly be rude and to ignore individuals who are literally there, and introducing people both to fundamental, locations on the Colorado Plateau, explaining how to live in a very harsh and unforgiving climate. Reading this book for me was to experience a kind of heightened and growing anger at the way that Indigenous people's knowledge and voices were deliberately hidden through the infrastructures that she kind of unpacks here. Second, infrastructure once in place organizes power in Erica's book. While Bill Sewell, writing about structure, suggested that historical structures generally, quote, are multiple, overlapping, and relatively autonomous rather than as forming a single unified totality of some kind, infrastructures of dispossession in Erica's book function not to create a single totality or anything like that, but to organize power such that the Dene and other Indigenous peoples on the Colorado Plateau and their claims to ownership of and sovereignty over ancestral lands could functionally be erased in a variety of realms in both local society, national polity, legal structures. She shows this really beautifully in the explication of Bedoni v. Higginson, which is a major kind of component of the last chapter of the book. This is a legal case in which the infrastructure of American public lands, in this case, the designation of Rainbow Bridge as a national monument by presidential decree. I'm not going to try to attempt the Navajo, Erica. You can do that if you feel able. The way that this presidential declaration of land as a national monument functionally served to and legally served as the means by which any suggestion of Dene claims to possession of a spiritually vital location were rendered legally kind of outside the bounds of kind of American property law. I'd love to have us talk more later about what Erica's book tells us about the ways in which legal doctrines of religious freedom, which are currently like very much the rage, right, in American jurisprudence, have their own infrastructures that rule kind of Indigenous religiosity, kind of outside the bounds of what constitutes an quote unquote organized religion, which I like. There's a really lovely part in that chapter where Erica unpacks kind of how kind of Indigenous religiosity is ruled to not be an organized religion. It's both very kind of well narrated and like absolutely infuriating. Infrastructures of dispossession, Erica seems to suggest, organized power, colonial power in this case, in ways that historians writing about structure more generally have not paid enough attention to. Finally, infrastructure once in place limits possibility and resists change. Structures, as Bill Sewell conceptualized them in his article that's been important to me, Historical Events as the Transformation of Structures, said that kind of structures really subject to significant transformation by organized oppositional forces. Indeed, he argues that the way we understand what a historical event is by understanding the transformation of historical structures. That does not seem to be the same for infrastructures. However, once they exist once they exist in space, time, and place. I had made a similar argument in my book about the way that the physical infrastructure of coal lines, power plants, and power lines that link the Navajo Nation to southwestern cities really resisted efforts at change once it existed, as a form of capital set in place. But I'd love to hear Erica talk more about the possibility for successful challenge to and transformation of the less material infrastructural elements that constitute the infrastructure of development. How subject are they to challenge or change? Would altering the material infrastructure of Glen Canyon Dam undermine the infrastructure of dispossession in significant ways? How does Bears Ears, which is in the epilogue of our book, is this building on the existing infrastructure of dispossession, or is it serving to kind of provide an alternate kind of infrastructure? I'll close there and just want to kind of close again by thanking Erica for writing such a rich, provocative, and deeply humane book. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion that follows.
Thank you. CJ.
Where do I go? Is it Jane?
No. She'll close.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, I'll go then. So this is what this is one of the things I love about this book, and because well, first of all, let me just say that yes, Andrew, it's a beautiful physical book. Like, if for those of you who haven't actually gotten your hands on this thing, it's really quite lovely, and that is what UT Press does. And so I have like a separate kind of relationship to this insofar as I'm on the faculty advisory committee for UT Press. So I was there in the room when we all voted unanimously to like, let's publish this book, and it was really fun, and we were all really excited about it. So it's a real pleasure to see this sitting on the table in front of me. One of the things that resonated with me so much, just as a kind of a similar aspect, what I experienced writing my own work about dams and water and that kind of thing, is that this is a book that you can use to learn how to read landscapes, to read infrastructure. And one of the points you make is how once these constructions are in place, they just become self-evident, or they become naturalized, they become kind of foregone conclusions. And there's a whole tradition of reading landscapes in like vernacular architecture studies and vernacular landscape studies. That's not what Erica's doing. She's doing a more intellectual history about how you might read the ideas that go into forming vernacular landscapes and infrastructural landscapes. So I found that really, really satisfying. I want to note something that I think is really important, especially since we're all here, not all of you Zoom people, but we're all here in this room in Texas, about the nature of dispossession in the context of quote unquote public lands and public land states. So with Texas, dispossession means something different insofar as it's just the kind of the steamroller of privatization. To some extent state control, but privatization, which also explains why there's so few federally recognized tribes in Texas, versus instances like you're describing, where the fight is, yeah, definitely with Mormons, in many instances, but also with the Forest Service and with the National Park Service. And like, I know Jane, the Taos people is the kind of the classic example of Blue Lake, winning that back from the forest, or from the government. And so I want to hear your thoughts, especially given where we are here, about like just thinking about that dimension of dispossession, which I think is really interesting. As I was reading this, I thought a lot about the future. It's framed in terms of climate change, and there's a way that we've come to talk about hydraulic engineering is a very short-sighted project. But in some ways that like dam construction and the boosters of dam construction had this strange commitment to the future, but in this very narrow way, like, well, you know, we need this to work for like, 300 years until the silt builds up, and then we'll have to dredge it, you know, so that they're thinking very, very far into the future, but not really, right? Because the thinking and the durability of dams has like already changed fairly dramatically, even since this was built in the 1960s. And so I think about David Troyer's Atlantic piece last year, where he advocated form of reparations for Native peoples, giving the national parks back to tribal control. And it's just a massive pile-on, and everybody hated it, just for precisely the reason, well, not everybody, but the predictable people, you know, hated it precisely because of the points that you make of the kind of hardwired, inherited assumptions about what the proper use of land is or isn't. And I think I was just teaching and Scott Momaday in my class right before I came here, and we were looking at a passage where he talks about tribal peoples, in this case specifically Jemez, as practicing a long outwaiting, right? Like a much deeper longitudinal way of understanding land and meaning, the likes of which you talk about a lot in this book. And so I want to hear your thoughts. And I know historians hate this question about the future, and you know,
Yeah.
but outside of the predictable contexts of what about climate change and what about the levels of the dam, but really like what is this, what is uncovering the infrastructures of dispossession? How does that take us a step forward toward rethinking like an alternative way of thinking about sustainability in like a deeper kind of spiritual sense? To that point, I'm very interested to hear your thoughts about belief. And this is where it gets super tricky. So for those of you who haven't read the book, you know, we're in this landscape with Latter-day Saints and some converted Native peoples to Mormonism and then multiple tribal affiliations. So it's very complicated. And I think that part of the punch of Native claims, even though, as Andrew pointed out, it doesn't really resonate in terms of organized religion, is that these are sacred sites, and that sacrality is an unimpeachable truth from our point of view as readers, while at the same time, the Latter-day Saint convictions about what the desert means, who these people, you know, who other people were, is, you know, certainly fair game for like a retroactive critique for the damage it caused and the blindness from which it suffered and the disruption that it created in these landscapes, but nonetheless constituted a true belief, not just a excuse for exploitation. Right, it's just that the belief expressed itself as a form of environmental exploitation. And so I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about that, you know, that aspect. And then the final point that I would make, and this is especially for all the grad students out there, and I know there's quite a few. This is, even though it's an intellectual history, in large part, this is a field project. These are archives that you've spent many, many years working in. They're regional archives for the most part. You're on the Colorado Plateau, you're in the canyons, you know, you're talking to people there on site. And so I want to hear your thoughts about the field component of this project and just how that relates to, I think, environmental history more generally, but also, and another tricky question, your thoughts about the extent to which the regional archives like this, as many archives do, tend to heavily slant toward encounter narratives. And so the tension between, you know, as you say in the intro, like, I'm not going to write this from Indigenous points of view, but I'm also going to try to I'm gonna try to manage that tension between, you know, the points of view of outsiders and then what must have been actually the points of view of different sort of interests among Native communities. And so that question of the field, the question of the archive, I'd be really curious, and I think the room would be very interested to hear your thoughts about as well. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Professor Casey.
Hi there. I'm coming from the land of the Nui, the Southern Paiutes. And I'm coming from a very comfortable house where we have transformed the environment. So 1.5 million people can live here, or I guess closer to 2 million people, with 34 members of the Las Vegas Paiute tribe. And that speaks to some of the environmental issues that, of course, Erica addressed in the book itself. I first met Erica when she presented some of the early preparations of this book at a seminar that the Red Center conducted at Brigham Young University, and it was in preparation for our book, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History. And it was one of the finest essays of the book, and we were very honored to have her participation in it. And to follow up on what the previous speaker just said, what I was thinking about is what do you do with conflicting narratives? And I guess it's because I'm an English professor. I was looking at narratives and what do you do when sacred narratives compete? And I think one thing that Erica does really well is to demonstrate how the LDS narratives about place and about people are sacred to them and used as justification. And the various Native tribes, of course, have their own sacred narratives, which are embedded in place in a different way than the LDS narratives. And I think this is crucial to understanding a lot of the conflicts that happen. She introduces the other narratives, the environmental narrative, the geological narrative, the legal narratives that occur around this. And they're all different stories, but they come in conflict. And who wins that conflict is part of that dispossession in what's going on. And so those are the kinds of things that I was thinking about. How do you sort out those narratives, especially when you are inhibited by language? If you brought up Taos Pueblo, which is where my family is from, but I was actually born in Colorado, and my father was working for the Utes as part of the Great Ute Settlement. And he was assigned to work with the Ute Mountain Utes, which are actually part of this geography of the Colorado Plateau. And the tribal council there could not speak English. They had to rely on a translator. And it was a non-Indian translator, and it led to all sorts of political conflicts. And so you have that from the very beginning. And that's one thing I really, really admire about this book is her ability to use sources and to sort out some of those inherent conflicts, especially when the Indigenous people are at a disadvantage linguistically, because the people making the decisions are the English speakers. And the thing that she ties really nicely together, especially in the Bedoni case, is how Indigenous language roots in the foundations of Indigenous study, which are land, language, and sovereignty. And it keeps coming back to that. The land, the place where Glen Canyon is, and its surrounding areas, and the different tribes that have an investment in that area. It's not just real estate. It's who these people are. It's where they come from. It's how their origins are embedded in place. And that's true of the Bears Ears too. And one of the issues that needs to be sorted out. And how those places are named. Who gets the right? Who gets to draw the maps? Who gets to name the places? And then it falls back on tribal sovereignty, which is, well, until the recent Supreme Court gaining ground. We'll see how it goes now with the current status of the court. So one of the things I really admire about what Erica has done in this study is she takes these conflicting ideas, and from the responses of the others, I can see that they're persuaded in one particular way, but I think she gives value to these voices and these beliefs as they come in conflict. And I really admire that aspect of what's going on. So conflicting narratives, how do you resolve those? I guess is my big question. And you can look historically at how they've been resolved, but it's an ongoing process of how those are resolved. And even within tribes themselves, there are conflicting narratives and conflicting points of view. And I think that she did a really magnificent job of pointing out how, you know, the Navajo Nation, 400,000 members, most of them living there. You're not going to get 400,000 agreements on how things should be resolved. And I know she had to cut a lot of things, but it's so interesting to watch the transformation of Page, the towers coming down, and the coal production, and the different environmental issues that have changed over this as a result of Glen Canyon. So thank you, Erica, for your wonderful work.
Okay, I'm not really sure where to start. Everybody covered such amazing stuff and so many discrete topics. But I think I'll start with what Jane talked about the, like, how do you resolve conflict? And that was honestly, so I was kind of happy. I'm happy this came up because one of the things I was hoping we could discuss as a group was process. And that was the biggest challenge in writing the book, was actually keeping all the different strands of the story, and there were so many of them. So all the different belief systems that are coming, that are coexisting on the landscape, some new, some very old, coming into conflict. Knowing that I was at a, you know, I do not speak Ute. You know, I had primarily English language sources detailing those conflicts. How can I use those fairly to make sure that I am explaining what is happening on the ground? So for me, I had to constantly keep the fact that there was conflict between the different populations in mind, and conflicting narratives happening at the same time. So in the first chapter, where I think that is the kind of first big instance of this, where the LDS settlers are moving down into southern Utah and northern Arizona, and it's a mission. You know, they're on a mission. They are devout. They believe, you know, they believe what they are doing is, you know, God wants them to do it. It's a sort of shorthand way of explaining something very complicated. And they're coming into contact with the Ute and Paiute, and they're, you know, things are not going well. Things are not going the way that they expected to go. Indigenous, and the same thing is happening for Indigenous people. The Paiute are the most vulnerable on the landscape in terms of both white settlement and other Indigenous people. And so, you know, they make accommodations with the LDS settlers. And, just sort of reading the actions about when conflict occurs and breaks out and how it occurs and breaks out and what gets said, what gets translated, how different translations yield different information was really, really tricky to kind of parse all those different threads out. So it always felt like I was doing an inadequate job of it. Just for all the grad students out there, it's I don't know if other historians feel this way or not, but yes, it's just like that was really difficult. And I think it gets to your question about belief, and that whole, Jane's comments and your comments kind of converge a little bit about belief in terms of, I think you're talking about the Bodoni case at the end. Is that what you were kind of asking me about, CJ, when you were bringing up belief?
Well, that and Rainbow.
Rainbow, yeah.
Yeah.
So for those of you who haven't read the case, the bare bones outline, and I will try to give it to you because it unfolds like over 200 years, basically, or more, where Rainbow Bridge is one of the largest natural arches in North America, for sure, and in the world. I think it's like second largest in the world. It was sacred to Indigenous people. There is history and ceremonies associated with that location. It is also on a land parcel that the government, so we have settlers who are moving into the region, then we have the government determining what to do with Indigenous people in the region. And the government numerous times gave the land surrounding Rainbow Bridge, first to the Paiute, then to the Navajo, then to white settlers, then back to the Navajo, then they made it into an Afro monument. So it was this kind of shifting, who was going to get this parcel of land, what was it going to be used for, who had claim to it. The government agents who are on the ground, basically, a lot of them don't know it's there until it's quote unquote discovered by white explorers who have Indigenous guides who take them to it, which is one of the big narratives of discovery in the book, false discovery in the book. So after it's found and the government sort of turns it into a monument, it becomes part of it is part of the canyons where as the dam is built, water will backflow into and around Rainbow Bridge National Monument, or the bridge itself. And the Navajo Nation is promised when it agrees to the construction of the dam in a land swap, the Navajo Nation actually gives the government the land it needs to build Page, Arizona as a staging area to construct the dam. They get section 1 of the act actually says it will protect Rainbow Bridge as a sacred site for the tribe and others. And then it becomes too expensive to do that from flooding. So the nation had wanted the water level to not flood essentially under the dam. So the court cases that emerges from this starts in the 1950s and 1960s with environmental groups who try to leverage, who regret that they agreed to the construction of Glen Canyon Dam in the larger environmental controversy. And by the 1970s, the environmental groups realized, oh, Indigenous people, the Dene, actually have a claim to this as a sacred site, and maybe we should involve them in this court case, which is one of the, like things kind of happen late between different populations. And they, the Navajo Nation then actually helps file a court case to protect Rainbow Bridge. And then eventually the judge that rules on the court case for the protection of Rainbow Bridge, and they make a freedom of religion claim. They say it's a First Amendment right. We can no longer practice our religion here because the water is inundating the bridge. The judge who rules on the case is the descendant of one of the LDS settlers who actually settled in that region. And he is the one, Andrew, and this is what Andrew was referring to in explaining this entire court case. He's the one who actually says, well, Navajos don't have a property claim In other words, it's not their land, and therefore, because it's the national monument land, they have no standing to bring this suit. And he says like that, you know, part of that is true. But this is where the infrastructures of dispossession come in, because it was Navajo land and had been Navajo land for a really long time. And it's the way in which the government drew boundaries and borders around determining whose land that is, which actually invalidates their claim to the lawsuit, or the claim to their claim to the sacred space. And then he says, well, Navajos don't have a religion because they don't have an organized time every week when they practice their religion at Rainbow Bridge. And the Navajo claim had always been, the bridge was used for very specific ceremonies at very specific times of year, and sometimes not even yearly, sometimes every couple of years. So started to parse out all of the ways in which what is sacred and sacred to whom became a kind of force of the book, which Jen Graber helped me with a lot as a religious studies professor. And so it was really, you know, I know that was a long, complicated answer, but it was not easy to actually track who had access to the place, who worshiped at that place, how they worshiped at that place, when they worshiped at that place, including the LDS settlers who, as the dam is being built, or prior to the dam being built, they actually use the river for semi-quasi-religious purposes. They go on trips, river trips. The LDS groups of LDS faithful go down the river. They worship at the place as part of their homeland, as part of their Zion, etc. So I just tried to represent everybody's viewpoint, but actually get to the root of the issues that are represented in the infrastructure of dispossession. And Andrew, maybe you can pick one of your kinds of questions for me to answer. I know we can open it up to other people because I want to make sure, but everybody gave me such wonderful comments. I'm just thrilled. But is there one in particular?
Sure. I'll just ask whether, you know, whether kind of how we should think about the relationship between the physical infrastructure of the dam and the infrastructures of you know, dispossession, which are more kind of institutional rather than material.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one thing that I think, having come to the end of the project, that I have come to firmly believe is we can't think of them as separate. And I think we have a tendency to do that, to think about there's the dam and it is a physical entity, and we have to determine what is going to happen with this physical entity and the water in this physical entity. And then maybe we'll turn to how laws are negotiated, et cetera, about the water and who has rights to the water and allocations of the water, et cetera. But I think that, and I hope that the project is useful for people, and as they are considering these issues, that those laws are fixed in place that do the work, to, in many cases, disadvantage Indigenous claims to that water. So from the very beginning, and Indigenous scholars have been saying this all along, I'm not the first person to say that, but I hope I am one of the people to show this in pretty sharp relief and how it is happening in the American West with the water rights. So I guess I do think that there is that's why the foundations of Glen Canyon Dam is the title of the book, because these foundations are truly structural in that, you know, laws are put in place that almost predetermine the outcome of the cases that are, as they are brought to them. And I think that we need to be very mindful of that as we think about the future of the water in the region and who has access to it.
That's great. That's great.
Right, questions?
We have a couple from the online audience. There's someone with their raised hand.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh. Javier Ramiro.
Okay, yes. Thank you very much. It was a very nice reading. So I was thinking about one of the main points that you emphasize, which is mainly that the development is mostly linked to the people who are more privileged, right? That the construction of the dam mostly helped those who were more privileged to have more power. And that's something that I was very, that's a point that really helped me to see that sometimes development it's not for all the population, but just for a very few and privileged segment. So that's mainly a comment and more than a question. So it was I really liked your reading. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, Erica. And I've read the book earlier, so it was great, but it was actually the various the commentaries on it really brought out important aspects and very interesting features. I had really liked the legal chapter, the sort of that section, but I was thinking about it now. So there is something in American public law about natural resources, water, petroleum, and other things, which is essentially that the first user gets priority. Now, that's not everywhere present, in all world legal systems, especially in the old English common law systems where the king actually owns all subsoil rights. So, however, isn't the kind of indigenous claim or the Navajo claim to some of these areas and lands another version of the first user principle? It's a more generalized version of the first user principle. So what would be the legal foundation for that claim in that event?
Well, I think you're getting into the finer points of treaty law, and there are probably some people who are on this channel right now. If Andrew is still here, he might have some things to say about that, and I would love for him to say something about that. Either Andrew Needham or Andrew Curley, both of them will have some things to say about this. But I do think that like one of the things that will come out at the 1922 Colorado River Compact is there are 31 tribes on the Colorado Plateau who have treaty rights to the Colorado River, or rights to the Colorado River, who were not at that 1922 conference when they divided up the rights to the river. And that is something that is yet to be determined how that is going to play out. So that's a big legal, this will be a big legal issue. Which tribes have the infrastructure, which is one of the things that a lot of people are talking about, to actually access that water in a way where they can use it, and which ones have the legal framework to bring a court case where they could actually get access to those rights, because it's very expensive. It will be very time consuming. It already is very time consuming. A lot of those tribes are already fighting for those water rights. So we're talking about decades worth of legislation or litigation. So yeah, kind of, yes, I think you're right, but I would be interested in if some of the other panelists want to chime in on that question, because it's a good question and a really important one for us.
Everyone's looking up at the screen, so I'm assuming that that's me or the other Andrew. I'll just say that I think that this gets to one of the kind of other elements of kind of a legal infrastructure of the way that Indian laws function, right? Which is there may be kind of there may be rights in theory, right? I mean, the Winters Doctrine gives immense water rights in theory to kind of tribes in the Colorado River Basin, but the rights in practice, right, have never there has never been the infrastructure put in place to allow those theoretical rights to become practical rights. And so I think that there is the idea of the possession of water, and then there is the actual then there's the actual possession, and now from my reading on the frantic efforts to reallocate the Colorado, is that the way that frequently that this discrepancy between legal rights and practical rights gets worked out is through payment, right? And so money becomes kind of money becomes a way in which the rights to, water, which, allows, possibility, then becomes, becomes in a way financialized for tribes. Andrew knows a lot, Curly knows a lot more about this than me, so he should chime in if he's still here.
Andrew, Curly, you want to say something?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? That part of the question was hard for me to understand.
Sumit, you want to repeat the question?
Okay. No, well, I mean, it shows my very limited grounding in American public law, but well, for example, in the Republic of India and in the British Empire in India before independence, there were very limited private rights in water and water courses, and they could be commandeered and awarded by, sort of state tribunals for different uses and purposes. And so that is different than the American conception of water rights, subsoil rights in things like minerals and petroleum, where the first user has in principle priority over all secondary users and so on. So my question was, is the legal foundation of Navajo and other claims to the water of the Colorado a first user claim, or is it founded on some other basis? And Erica suggested that it might be treaties, which would be another diversion. So this
yeah.
Comparative question, because this is an unusual feature. I mean, not an unusual feature, but it's a feature of American public law, which is not necessarily universal.
Yeah, no, now I understand the question. So yeah, actually, I should pass it off to Dr. Maria Lane, who's also here, who knows this stuff. But from we'll just keep passing it off. My understanding is that that like surface water rights in the West are ones that are seen as taking on that kind of characteristic in the law as first in use, first in right, which is divorced from understandings of aquifer water. And with the Colorado River in particular, it has different kinds of legal characteristics. So it does have a riparian characteristic when you think about it with Mexico and the United States. There is a treaty, I think was signed in 1944, 48, that guarantees a certain amount of water gets to Mexico. And then the division of the Colorado River through the Colorado Compact divides the rest of the water to the 7 Colorado Basin states. Internally, the states have been damming the water based on these kind of the doctrines of first in use, first in right, like the Salt River in Arizona, the Gila River in Arizona, the Little Colorado River. All of these as tributaries of the Colorado River were dammed prior to the Colorado Compact and the adoption and formal adoption of water codes. And each of the different states have their own water codes, and many of those states use that, are basing their water laws on that doctrine. So that's my quick understanding.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, CJ wants to.
On your behalf. So I find almost nothing more frustrating than going to the library, trying to learn something about water or rivers and coming across a bunch of laws.
Yeah.
In which rivers are incidental.
Yeah.
In which rivers don't really matter. And so I think that part of what I really love about your discussion of the legal implications of this is that part of the problem is thinking in terms of legal strategies to begin with, of course, which has to be done in the context of like the world we live in, but that the premise of the legal strategies forces you to understand water as a resource, as opposed to something with like intrinsic or spiritual or like eternal kind of value. And so you have to twist your sense of like, well, we'll call it this aspect, but like that is part of what you're arguing against. Is that the point is that Indigenous understanding of the landscape and of water can't be reduced to like just where does it fit into the common law, or where does it fit into the physical infrastructure, as Andrew pointed out.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And I tried to make that point in the book.
Oh, good.
Yeah. I mean, and it was really frustrating because there is a whole legal framework and legal scholars are working in that framework and they're doing great work, but I guess one of the things I really wanted to show was how, how that framework, it's really hard for Indigenous people to engage with that framework because that framework almost totally disregards, their sense of place from the very beginning, right? And so, yeah, that's exactly right.
I think we have another question from our online audience. It's from Catherine Pearson. I don't know if she wants to make the question, like you can unmute yourself.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm just well, I'm from the University of Oklahoma, and I worked in the College of Engineering. I had a lot of conferences that were in Las Vegas, and we've also driven there through to see the Grand Canyon and gone through Hoover Dam and whatnot. But anyway, if you go to Las Vegas, I mean, how many high rises and people are in that place? And you start realizing how much water they are using. And all those hotels, motels, whatever they are. And I worry, or I'm concerned. I'm not a First American. We have that museum here in the Oklahoma City. I've been there with a friend of mine. And I just do. I worry why is Vegas helping in this issue of the lost water? And I know your first dam isn't on the Colorado River, but don't they all interconnect and everything goes south?
Yeah, I mean, the Glen Canyon Dam is also on the Colorado River. It's upriver from Lake Mead, Lake Powell's up from north of Lake Mead. But I think, Jane is in Las Vegas, and maybe she wants to discuss the water use in Vegas a little bit.
I can say a few things about this, especially with the recent conferences about water usage and the crisis with Lake Powell. All states agreed to conservation except the primary water user for the Colorado River, and that's California. Yeah,
Oh,
they're the primary user for agriculture from the river. And in all the news stories, I know this is a PR thing, but Las Vegas is held up as a water conservation. You can't have a yard. Can't. The public water displays are recycled water, and I know it's crazy to have a town like this in the middle of the desert, but by and far there are other users who use the water much more than Las Vegas.
Yeah,
Thank you. And agriculture is important, right?
Andrew?
Natural.
Well, I was just gonna say,
I won't comment on that. I have an issue about using HOAs where you gotta, do your lawn a certain way and put a pesticide on it. That's not my thing. And I'm sorry that people feel the need to have pretty lawns. Nature's okay with me.
I think Jen has.
Yeah, sorry.
I have a process question.
Okay.
Especially in terms of when you were putting the book together, these are not usually histories that are intertwined.
Yeah.
Especially the LDS part. And so I'm wondering if you had to, how you realized that was a part of the story. Okay, right? Because they're not usually the main players in environmental history work, right? And then how do you convince your editors, your early, in some ways you've got to, this is an unusual book, I think, in its cast of characters. And I can imagine the skeptical editor being like, really, this is how it all goes together? So I guess I'm asking you the process question, like, how did you realize that these are the strands that needed to come together? And then how do you convince, the kind of early readers, important readers and editors that this does work, right? Like that this is the narrative of the story, these voices.
Yeah, So that's a great question. And part of it comes back to the collection that Jane co-edited at BYU. And in writing that chapter, or writing an earlier version of what became chapter 4, this project started as something else. It started as an environmental history of concrete and how concrete was used in the American West. And I had started with Glen Canyon Dam. And because it's monumental, like the amount of concrete used in it was, unprecedented, from Lake Mead to Glen Canyon, which was even bigger than Lake Mead. And so in writing about the concrete and the political wrangling about this, I hit upon different elements. And one of those elements was a large company who had been involved in the construction of Glen Canyon Dam had LDS owners, and was run in part by some very powerful politically connected people to the LDS Church. And I initially thought about calling the project Damming Zion, because they really saw the dam as Utah's answer to the expansion of the faith. And in sort of looking at those, looking through those records, I was really struck by the political deal makers, the positions that they were in when the dam was first proposed, and how, and then sort of like unraveling each thread. So Arthur Vivian Watkins, who's a key player in the construction and getting the dam approved, the Colorado River Storage Project approved, he is both fighting with environmentalists, David Brower, and that's that sort of old story about, or important but well-trod story about Glen Canyon Dam. But he simultaneously was one of the key figures who was pushing a policy in 1954 called termination. And he called it the Native Americans Emancipation Proclamation. And these were coterminous pieces of legislation. And that's what I wrote about in the chapter that was in Jane's book. And that kind of cracked open the story for me in a way that made me think, oh, I need to go back and understand, why does Watkins care about both the reclamation of water and Indigenous people? We know that those are entangled concepts. And then that entanglement just kept getting pushed back further and further and more. And I kept seeing like more and more entanglements around that. And so the process question really kind of came from investigating something that which people in the scholarship have dealt with as two separate political impulses as one entangled.
And was there scholarship? I mean, because we're kind of in the Mormon history.
Yeah.
We're 20 or 30 years into it,
Yeah.
but there's this revolution in LDS scholarship or scholarship about the LDS. Like, did you find, were there voices there that you could interact with in terms of trying to not silo these histories?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them came from Indigenous people who had converted or were part of something called the Indian Placement Program, which was a program the LDS Church ran. Yeah. So the LDS Church kind of attempts to send missionaries and convert on the Navajo reservation in fits and starts. There are a couple of kind of key figures at the early period, but they don't really start in earnest until the 1940s. Which is the same time the dam is being proposed. And then they really, the whole idea, you can look at from the Bureau of Indian Affairs director is corresponding with Watkins about this, Dave Evans. He takes testimony from him about what, not Navajos themselves, what Navajos need or what the Dene people need, but he takes testimony from the Commissioner of Indian Affairs about what Navajos need, and he says they need water, right? And that water will lead to schooling and education, and they need an educated population. And so one way to get that educated population is through the Indian Placement Program, taking Navajo children from their homes and placing them with Mormon families where they will be converted, etc. So these threads all kind of came together in this program, and some of that actually got cut from the book, but I will probably write a longer article about it. But it was really the process of really exploring LDS ideas about the water and about the landscape and about the original inhabitants who lived on that landscape, and then tracking back, pushing back further and further to like explore where those ideas came from, how they developed over time, and how they kind of culminated in that moment.
Victor.
Oh yeah, there's
Yeah, so thanks so much for this talk. I wanted to build on that last question, if I could, and ask another process question about interdisciplinarity, because in your introduction, you note scholars in other disciplines like anthropology. We have scholars from other disciplines like anthropology and English here at this event. You can't write about dams without writing about the natural sciences and engineering. And as Andrew Needham pointed out in his comments, even within a single field like studying settler colonialism, the conceptual apparatus and the vocabulary has been building up for enough time that there are valences to words like structure and infrastructure and process that are not obvious to people from outside the subfield. So I was hoping you could just talk a bit about how you tackled that challenge and spoke to all these different audiences in your book.
It's hard to do. It took me longer than it probably should have to figure out how to do that. But really it was reading widely and just reading, in all these different disciplines. I know CJ's had to do the same thing. To look at the papers of engineers and the plans of engineers, to look at the work that anthropologists are doing, to look at Indigenous study scholars who are who are writing and reconfiguring the landscape for us in ways that really help to read the work of other historians. Mark Harvey is here. His work is foundational to writing this kind of book. It was really trying to pull environmental history in line with these other disciplines to tell a richer story of the dam. I was able to do that because of all this other work, or attempt to do it because of all this other work.
Can I also add that Erica was very thorough in vetting this manuscript. She consulted a lot of people, a lot of Indigenous people, a lot of LDS people, historians, and people from different disciplines. And I think it really enriched the manuscript to have so many people review it.
Thank you. And it really, these things are collaborations. I think a book like this is a collaboration anyways.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Let me just, for the people on Zoom, my name is Ben Brower, and I'm a professor here at UT Austin. And I work on colonial Algeria, which is a sort of paradigm, I guess, of settler colonialism studies, although people in my field don't use it so much. Erica, the question I had was, we talked about law and we've talked about religions in terms of adjudicating these different claims to this place and its resources and so forth. And I wonder if Jane Heffen, I think at the beginning, was talking about the Supreme Court case. I think you were talking about sovereignty. And I'm wondering if sovereignty is something that comes up in these different sorts of discourses and debates and struggles, and if it's a way in which, is sovereignty, as we understand it today, at the beginning of the 21st century, with regards to native rights, something different than it is in the middle of the 20th century. I guess the LDS probably have their own notions of the relationship of sovereignty to the United States. There might also some sort of underground histories that might be figured in this.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely sovereignty is a crucial part of the story of the history of Indigenous people and their claims to the land and their treaty rights. And, the Navajo Nation is engaging with the government in a government to government interaction, right? This is one sovereign nation negotiating with another nation. From the Navajo perspective, the government, whether the U.S. government sees it that way, kind of changes at different, in different ways over the course of the 20th century and up until today. But the LDS Church certainly see, I mean, when the LDS settlers first get to the Colorado Plateau, they actually create what they call the state of Deseret, which is their own nation state of sort until they kind of, are in the crosshairs of the federal government, and they rethink that and become the territory, the Utah Territory, and then eventually when they get rid of polygamy, the state of Utah. And that is a pretty hard fought battle for them. And they don't necessarily want to give up. Brigham Young as the first president and then governor don't want to give up on those ideas of, of leadership, sovereignty, pretty easily. And there's a lot of great literature on that by people like Paul Reeve and at the University of Utah, etc. So sovereignty configures in different ways. I don't deal so much with sovereignty in the LDS chapter, but it certainly comes into play in the rest.
But sovereignty from the perspective of the natives and changing understandings from the 60s to the present. Are there any transformations?
Are there any transformations in terms of how Indigenous nations view the concept of sovereignty from the 1960s to the, yes, that is, I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert on that. I think there are probably people here on this call who know more about that than I do. But the Navajo Nation, when they are negotiating with the federal government, they willingly engage in that land swap because the president of the Navajo Nation, and this is one of the things that Jane was getting at, not all Navajos think the same way, and there were disconnects between the government, the representatives in Navajo Nation, even within the government, but the leadership who negotiated with the federal government for the land swap and others who did not. And the book actually opens with Raymond Nakai, who is tribal chairman, who has lots of faith that the dam is going to be built and the Navajos are going to get concessions for it, and it's going to bring water and power to the nation. And within a pretty short period of time, he has those hopes kind of dashed. So he's asked to speak at the dedication of the dam. He's the first person to be cut from the program when the other speakers go long. Then a few, a little like 18 months later, he's asked to speak again at the dedication of the reservoir. When the reservoir is filling, he's still relatively hopeful. And then 3 months after that, he speaks at an event in Page, Arizona, where he basically realizes, or he's in the process of realizing that the government is no longer negotiating in good faith. And he's speaking both as a leader of his, of a nation, and as somebody who feels as a resident of the region who isn't getting, the sort of the promises are unfulfilled. And he's addressing in particular how the Navajo Nation had negotiated with the federal government and how they thought it would improve their relationships with the states of Utah and Arizona, and then how it is not improving their relationships with the state of Utah and Arizona. So the government to government, nation to nation, nation to state is like relationships are all breaking down within this very short time period, when essentially the states and the federal government have gotten what they want from the Navajo Nation. And, Nakai is realizing the power dynamics at play are no longer in his favor. So.
I think it's also really interesting that like when you think about like the sort of the standard narrative of dam history is it's like, well, we're going to build these dams, they're going to last forever, they represent a sort of a sense of permanence.
Right.
And I think it's easy to read a book like this, even though you end on like on a kind of a high note, like a concession, like high note. But it's easy to read a book like this and be like, oh my God, like what a demolition job of settler colonialism. And I think that, I don't know, I read it in some ways as in the face of that initial engineering hubris, it's actually remarkable how dramatically thinking has changed.
Yeah.
And sovereignty is a good instance of this, because, and this goes back to your question, Andrew, about like what would actually happen if the dam were to be removed?
Yeah.
Well, what is happening with other dam removal programs
Yeah.
is like a new philosophy of rewilding,
Mhm.
a new philosophy of sovereignty of non-human animals, sovereignty of rivers themselves and ecological flows. And also kind of a post-sovereignty thinking among many tribal peoples of like, we don't want to deal with like this, you know, with like just the legal apparatus of all this stuff.
I mean, the Pacific Northwest is a beautiful example of what is dam removal and what's happening in those places. Andrew, it looks like you wanted to say something too. Andrew,
I was just going to say the darker discourse around the removal of Glen Canyon Dam is less about the kind of protecting the, you know, the autonomous nature of the Colorado as an ecological structure, and is more about preserving Lake Mead as a viable and preserving the power head at Lake Mead as a viable I mean, it seems to be the discussion seems to be basically we can have enough, there can be enough water for one of these dams, but not two.
Yeah, that is for sure happening.
And the other thing that's happening is St. George wants to pipe water from here to Lake Powell.
I actually end with that. I think that's like the final paragraph in the book, where this plan is called the Lake Powell pipeline, and it's a proposal to pipe water from like essentially all the way across 150 miles across the desert from Lake Powell to St. George, which is becoming kind of a suburb in some ways of Las Vegas, Jane, don't you think, a little bit? And it's a community that has like 14 golf courses. And it's the fastest growing, it is the fastest growing municipality in the United States right now. And they have, you know, where are they going to get their water? It is like a crazy, that is a kind of interesting challenge.
This is a question that comes out of absolute ignorance, but there are these two basins, the lower and the upper, that you mentioned at the beginning of the map, and there are all these dams and all these lakes and all these aqueducts going all the way to California from the map. Did any indigenous nation benefit from any of these infrastructure?
I don't know if you all heard that question. Did any indigenous nation benefit from any of these reservoirs or lakes? Lots of indigenous communities are fighting to benefit from some of these tributaries and lakes. The one possible case is Navajo Dam. Andrew Curley might have something to say about this. One of the things that Watkins does as he's trying to push termination and get the land parcel that the government needs to build Glen Canyon Dam, Navajo Nation really wants this dam called Navajo Dam, and he actually threatens to withdraw this dam from the proposals if the Navajo Nation actually fights termination. So Navajo Nation did not come out as a strong opponent publicly against the policy of termination. And one of the reasons why is of this kind of political wrangling that was occurring. And now Navajo Nation does rely, at least many residents of Navajo Nation, in part on the water from Navajo Dam. And when the government wanted to keep the water level at Lake Powell high, the first dam they siphoned water from to do that, to stabilize the water level, was Navajo Dam. So the answer to that question is maybe a little, but not a lot in any case across. I don't know so much about the lower basin. The person who knows, well, the people who know more about the lower basin, Andrew Curley and Tracy Boyles will be here to talk about that 1922 river compact. Teresa Montoya will also be here to talk about the upper basin states with me and these, but this is a kind of largely artificial designation or divide between the lower and upper basin states. It was really kind of, again, represented this political wrangling.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Each two.
Sorry.
Thank you very much for the presentation and providing a chapter of the book for us to read. And thank you to the other panelists for the questions and comments. I've been just really racking my brain about all this stuff that is familiar to me, and then also like unfamiliar in the way, not in a bad way, in a good way. It's like thinking about things differently now, and learning new things. And I'm just really stuck in this Nakai, on Glen Canyon, talking about the dam and kind of going back and forth between his support and his reluctance as the chairman of the Navajo Nation. And what I find really interesting, the thing that was really interesting for me about this text was the way that LDS, the Mormons, what is it called, Latter-day Saints, how their framework kind of builds into this relationship with nature that is, how we can sometimes categorize it all as colonial, but there are different kinds of different colonial actors at work with their own particular histories. And one thing that's unique, sorry, I'm getting to the question. One thing that's unique about this time is Stuart Udall, who is also a member of the LDS, coming from Arizona, but also having to like balance a bunch of interests, including upper basin states or California. And I'm wondering, to what degree does Stuart Udall's Mormonism influence his own support or opposition to certain projects? Is his thinking consistent with the LDS and other political actors who are LDS while they're re-engineering the environment in these ways?
That's a super interesting question. And the best instance of that, or the best way to answer that, is when the court case, the Bodoni court case, is filed, we have Angus Woodbury, who I talk about in the book, who is an ecologist and a biologist at the University of Utah, and he becomes a kind of political advisor to Udall and Dawson and Watkins and a lot of these politicians. Udall arranges for a whole bunch of people to fly out to fly into Arizona and then take helicopters to Rainbow Bridge, so they can survey whether or not a diversion dam should be built to keep water from inundating Rainbow Bridge National Monument, or flowing under the National Monument. And the way into that, answering that question, Andrew, is Woodbury kind of has, I guess we call him a secular Mormon. He is no longer like as devout as his predecessor, as his family, his ancestors had been. They settled in the region of northern Arizona, but Udall invites him, or he wrangles an invitation to be an advisor to Udall. And the two of them talk about like their kind of shared heritage. And Udall had been very instrumental, negotiated a lot with Navajo Nation, had really attempted to represent Navajo Nation, but there is no indication in any of the paperwork. There were two representatives from Navajo Nation who were invited on this trip. There were like 55 people. Lots of people give presentations. I could find almost no indication that members of Navajo Nation were actually given a voice to make any decisions about what was going to happen to Rainbow Bridge. And so, but lots of indication that Dawson and Woodbury and other LDS politicians or advisors to politicians did have a pretty strong voice in influencing what happens. And Udall actually puts forward a proposal to turn essentially the whole region into a national park. That we have people like Woodbury who are really sort of pushing for those kinds of proposals. So, I mean, that's an excellent question. And it does seem like that his LDS heritage really does influence him in terms of the decisions that he's making. I'm not saying that building a diversion dam in any of the sites, I lay out the sites in the book, and other people have covered this, would have would have been environmentally, I mean, it's putting more infrastructure in the landscape in ways that, potentially would have harmed it or at least spoiled it in terms of its vision. But the fact that Navajos are individual Navajos from the surrounding area, the immediate surrounding area, from the chapters around closest to Rainbow Bridge, are pushing legislation, and none of them are actually asked to chime in on this. Actually shows us the tilt in UDAL's power brokers, many of whom are LDS to UDAL's. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Who's the
No,
last?
I just had a quick, a lot about water, not much about electricity.
Yeah.
Navajo reservation is sort of notoriously one of the least served
Yeah.
with electric power, yet they have this gigantic hydroelectric dam right there. How much does that play into the Navajo Nation officials' attitude toward the dam project, their support for it, and then I get their sense of disillusionment about it?
Yeah, well, okay, so this is where Andrew Needham's book and my book intersect, because he is the one who wrote about electricity on the Navajo Nation, and exactly these kinds of issues. So maybe I can answer that question, Andrew, and then you can have a final word in there. So how in the debates, or as the Navajo Nation, and it's not just one, it's just not Nakai. There are two predecessors to Nakai. The government talks to them about the water that the dam will bring to the region, and they largely frame it as you will get concessions from the shoreline that border Navajo Nation, so gas stations, tourism, etc. So the way that the Bureau of Reclamation and the federal government pitches the project to Navajo Nation, at least in the documents that I have seen, I know there are potentially other documents around this, it becomes largely a conversation about economic development through the water infrastructure that's going to be built. And yes, it's a hydroelectric dam, and this is where I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to answer that question.
Well, I'll just say that once the infrastructure is in place, it is a powerful physical metaphor for the underdevelopment of the Navajo Nation, and it produces a bunch of different to go to kind of Erica's point. I mean, one of the things that it really produces is a diverse number of responses from different people, as one would expect. It ranges from the tribal president subsequent to Nakai, Peter McDonald, essentially saying that this makes the case for the nationalization of resources, and the canceling of contracts. All of this, kind of comes up, is blocked by the kind of legal infrastructure that Erica talks about. But he says we need what we need is more, is further development that the Navajo Nation will control to kind of create a powerful Navajo state. At the same time, you have lots of people saying, no, this is a kind of the very nature of this colonial infrastructure means that the way to decolonize is to kind of abandon this kind of further development, and to kind of reject kind of further further electrical development. So along with the hydroelectric dam are a series of coal-fired power plants. One of them literally within sight of Glen Canyon Dam that came down. The stacks came down a couple of years ago, and it was decommissioned. And so like all of this, one of the manifestations of this was the production of the Navajo Nation as an energy colony of the Southwest. And then, people are faced with all of those dilemmas of decolonization, and particularly of what to do when, you know, economies have been so developed by primary resource extraction for use elsewhere. So it produces really a kind of range of responses, but it does serve as a real symbol of colonial location and underdevelopment within the kind of American economy.
But also just really practically, I mean, for those of you who don't know the Colorado Plateau, traditional Navajo settlement is very dispersed.
Yeah, it's not.
So what would it even look like to channel like 400, kilowatts to like over such a huge territory with transmission wires here, there, and everywhere. And so I think it's an example of not just the underdevelopment question, but also the incommensurability between traditional Indigenous society and modern infrastructure projects as a category.
Yeah, and I think it also sort of speaks to the kind of way in which we get locked into thinking about infrastructure in one specific way that keeps us from thinking about it in other ways, right? Yeah. There's a good question here from Mark Harvey, and I don't know if we want to end on that or
probably that would be the last one.
Okay.
We were overextended. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna read it unless Mark, you want to ask it to the group.
I can, Erica, or you feel free to read it if you like. Either way.
Go ahead and ask it. It's a great question.
Okay, well, I can't help think about the relationship or tensions between environmentalists like the Sierra Club and the many indigenous peoples that you write about in your book. In 1963, the Sierra Club published one of its most famous coffee table books, The Place No One Knew, filled with colorful photos of Glen Canyon before the dam and Lake Powell. One might view the title, The Place No One Knew, as a symbol of settler colonialism, the notion that Glen Canyon was completely unknown to anyone. This obviously erases indigenous occupation and knowledge of Glen Canyon. Nevertheless, Brower and the other environmentalists at the time questioned the need for Glen Canyon Dam and Echo Park and Dinosaur National Monument because they wanted to draw attention to the scenic beauties of the Colorado River Plateau and the value of protecting such sacred spaces. Maybe I shouldn't use air quotes. I haven't read your book, Erica, but I wonder if you think their point of view took into account indigenous people's own adoration of lands that they used, occupied, claimed, or not.
So the short answer is I actually cover this exact thing in the book, and okay. So because it is like the place no one knew is like the perfect symbol of settler colonialism. And the answer to that, the short answer to that is they did take into account indigenous ideas of the sacred at a moment when it was politically strategic for them to do so. And so when the Sierra Club actually tries and fails, Brower actually tries and fails to get the dam level reduced. And when the court throws out that court case, he actually writes a letter to Owen Olpen, who is his lawyer at the University of Utah. And he says, it's time, like, let's activate, let's try to activate our indigenous or our native allies here. Let's try to get those people, because all of our other attempts have failed. Maybe a freedom of religion claim will succeed. And so whether or not Brower took that seriously, I don't know. I was not able to find that out. But he does do it strategically. Or at least has some acknowledgement of that there potentially is a political strategy here that can keep Lake Powell, the level of Lake Powell, at a depth that will keep it from flooding the monument. But he's fixated on the monument as opposed to the sacred space. But they employ the language of the sacred space very freely in that book. So it's a kind of interesting tension to cover when thinking about that issue.
Well, thank you. I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone online for coming. I really appreciate it. Jane, Andrew, thank you, everybody. Brian, thank
Thanks,
you.
Erica.
And John.
So